This one's a classic.
Welcome back to our exploration of the forgotten areas of MapleStory. In this series, we take a look at some of the maps and regions throughout the game that have been removed or simply forgotten. The places you traveled through in order to reach your actual destination. These locations all have their own stories that I find very fascinating, so let's talk a bit about them. The rainforest east of Hinnesis is not a map that I would call forgotten. It doesn't even classify as a hidden street technically, but like so many of the areas throughout Victoria Island that we came to love, it was removed after Big Bang. It lies between the hill east of Hinnesis and the forest east of Hinnesis. They really wanted you to know that these maps are east of Hinnesis. As a kid, I thought this map was a great training spot, but it has very few spawns compared to other areas, and it's just not great in that regard. What it does excel at is being aesthetically pleasing. A lot of these Hinnesis maps share these fall-colored tree assets. They kind of look like aspen trees if I were to take a guess, but I'm not a tree guy. Something I vividly remember about this map are the foreground assets that were really good at hiding drops. This is something that we'd find on quite a few maps, and it's an interesting design choice, sacrificing gameplay for aesthetics. As we explore more maps in the future, I'll be sure to highlight these annoying foreground elements, as they're actually found in more places than you might expect. If you were truly broke in OSMS and you needed to head to Alinea from Hinnesis, this was a map you'd have to travel through. If you were doing the Camilla's Gym quest, you needed to pass through here to reach the hidden map that had the portal puzzle. After Pirates were released in version 62, this was also the route to reach Nautilus Harbor. By the time mini dungeons were added to the game, the rainforest east of Hinnesis held the portal that led to Hinnesis Pig Farm, which was a very good training map for low-level players. There were plenty of reasons to pass through here when you really get down to it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who found themselves walking through the rainforest east of Hinnesis more times than I care to remember. Monkey Forest 2. This is one of the first maps we're covering that actually underwent massive changes during the old school era, though it ultimately wasn't able to avoid the destruction that the Big Bang update brought. This is another one of those maps that I personally love, and I don't think it ever gets the recognition it deserves. The big names like Pig Beach, Forest of Golem, and Hinnesis Hunting Ground are the ones that get all the attention, and it makes sense, they're all very iconic. But Monkey Forest 2 is one of those forgotten maps that I think a small group of players will look back on fondly. The first version of this map from the launch of GMS is not even that memorable. There are a bunch of randomly placed platforms of varying sizes with lupins and zombie lupins placed throughout. There's probably a cohesive rotation that could be executed here, but I have no idea what it would have been. This is also not the version of the map that I think most people remember. In version 49, the update that added fourth job, leafry, and an overhaul to the world map system, Monkey Forest 2 was updated with an entirely new layout. This new layout seems to have been designed with a very specific goal in mind, giving ranged classes an amazingly simple and efficient training rotation. On both the top half and the bottom half of the map, there are these three platforms that hold lupins and zombie lupins. To the left of these three platforms is a series of smaller platforms that make a sort of triangle shape. Standing on these would allow you to completely avoid getting hit by the lupins' ranged attacks, as you'd simply be outside of their range. Archers have the furthest horizontal attacking range of any class in old school MapleStory, and hunters specifically had a skill called Bomb Arrow that would explode upon hitting a target, dealing splash AoE damage to anything around it. As it turns out, the range of this splash damage was just large enough that it would hit all three platforms. On top of that, there were hidden portals on the left tree that would teleport the player between the two sections of the map. A hunter could thrive here, getting some of the most consistent EXP rates available without much effort. Other ranged classes like gunslingers, assassins, and even crossbowmen could utilize this map as well, but it wasn't quite as efficient as some of the other options that they had access to. This map was really designed for Bomb Arrow. Aesthetically speaking, this map doesn't differ too greatly from the rest of Illenia. There are no special assets, but the wooden platforms and their specific layout is really what makes this map easy to recognize. Monkey Forest 2 is a map that I believe went under the radar for a large number of players. Bowmaster mains are probably familiar with it, but outside of that audience, Monkey Forest 2 is as hidden as the fairies of Illenia wanted it to be. Forest of Golem, one of my favorite maps in the game, and if you don't already understand why that is, let me enlighten you. Forest of Golem is a 4-layer map found deep in Sleepywood that contains primarily mixed golems and dark stone golems. Curse Eyes and normal lupins are found here as well, but they're mostly just a nuisance. Golems are large, slow-moving enemies with favorable HP to EXP ratios. They're decent monsters, and the layout of this map, as well as the density of the golems found on the 4 platforms, makes this a warrior's dream training spot. It was so good that it could be utilized for the majority of second job, even holding its own at the beginning of third job until it started to fall off around the mid-70s. If a player was strong enough, they could even begin training here as early as level 43 with a maple weapon that would give them the accuracy necessary to hit the golems. I've done it before. It's actually possible to train here and get good EXP for nearly 40 levels on a warrior. Other classes were capable of making use of Forest of Golem, including ranged classes, but I think Forest of Golem really benefits melee attackers and mages the most. Between the time I've spent playing various warriors as well as bandits, I have clocked in many hours of my life training in Forest of Golem. The music used here, which is simply the main Sleepywood theme, is actually one of my favorite songs in all of old school MapleStory. I would put it up there with the best of the best in terms of how relaxing it is to listen to. Forest of Golem is unlike anything else. An area that every warrior will either have fond memories of or waking nightmares remembering how much time they had to spend grinding here. Personally, I find Sleepywood to be a very relaxing area, and the music certainly helps, so I have nothing but love for Forest of Golem. Enough discussion about Victoria Island. Let's head to my favorite area in the game and discuss one of my favorite features that connects the floating city of Orbis to the snowy region of El Nath, Orbis Tower. "20 floors of mostly repetitive nonsense. Nobody really liked traveling through this tower, but we often found ourselves doing so anyway. On the 10th floor, there's an entrance to Huckle's hidden room. Huckle has, according to the quest he gives, been living in Orbis Tower for 30 years. The thing is, this was written 20 years ago, so he's actually been living in the Orbis Tower for 50 years now if we go by Earth time. Dude's old. Huckle has a quest wherein he will ask the player to acquire 20 Fire and Ice Sentinel shell pieces, as well as 45 Junior Sentinel shell pieces. Doing so and returning the items to him will reward the player with 5 Orbis Rock Scrolls. On both the first and 20th floor, you can find these magic rocks that are used as a teleport system between one another. One use costs 1 Orbis Rock Scroll, and Huckle has a billion of them to give out, but the quest is limited to 1 completion per day. As a kid, killing the Ice and Fire Sentinels was nearly impossible for me. They were just outside the level range I would comfortably reach before I got bored and started a new character, so I usually just ignored this quest and instead slowly walked all the way to the top or bottom of the tower as necessary. These scrolls were tradable, so a lot of players saw decent profit by doing this quest every day and selling off the scrolls to other players. I wish I had realized that I could do that when I was a kid. Otherwise, traversing through Orbis Tower without these scrolls was very tedious. Climbing down required navigation of the ropes and the mini platforms that were found all over the place, but this was resolved with the release of Down Jump in version 59. Climbing up the tower, however, was still very time-consuming. Despite common belief, every level of the Orbis Tower had a flag enabled that disallowed the use of return scrolls. Mystic Door could be used, and that helped priests get some use out of that skill. If I had to point to one type of enemy in this tower that I think may have been forgotten, it's definitely the Sentinels on the upper levels of the Orbis Tower, the same ones that you have to kill for Huckle's quest. These enemies have an extremely memorable design and name, but I still legitimately forgot about the regular non-elemental Sentinel enemies until I explored the tower again. The issue is they're so far out of the way on maps that don't have great layouts, so very few players would opt to grind on these enemies over the other offerings available. It just didn't make sense to do so. Outside of these mildly interesting enemies, the higher levels of Orbis Tower don't have much going on, but on the 8th floor we find a statue. This statue is used in a few quest lines. I believe it's part of the Red Draco Mount Unlock quest, as well as a few 4th job skill quests, but I don't actually remember specifics. What I can say for sure, though, is that it's involved in the quest line In Search of the Book of Ancient, one of the many stops that this quest line forces on the player that causes it to take so long to actually complete. Orbis Tower becomes snowy once you reach the 7th floor, as there are openings throughout the entire tower and no glass windows to speak of. I never really gave this much thought. The reason there's snow all over the place is because the tower is completely exposed to the elements. I always assumed it was just an aesthetic choice that meant you were close to El Nath, but it's also world building, which I can really appreciate. These snowy levels of the tower have the Leody monsters that are often forgotten. They didn't reside in any map that was worth grinding at, and their drops weren't anything special. They're cute though, they even make them in hat form. Towards the very bottom of the tower, we find Junior Pepes, another overlooked and forgotten enemy. They're just the young, small versions of the Pepe monsters. Another interesting thing we find on the 1st floor is the entrance to the Orbis Tower basement that leads to Aqua Road. Prior to the Lost Era of version 13 through 21, Orbis Tower had neither this basement nor the entry to it. The basement was added before Aqua Road was released, and from what I remember, it served as a sort of teaser for the area. Unfortunately, with this era of the game being lost, I can't confirm this. And that's the entirety of Orbis Tower, a very interesting area in one of my favorite regions of MapleStory. A tower I've both ascended and descended more times than I care to remember. A tower that held some significance in old school MapleStory, a game wherein you were forced to travel long distances on foot that eventually did away with this design, leaving behind these massive installations that have no place in a world dominated by instant travel. After descending the Orbis Tower, we find ourselves in El Nath, another one of my favorite areas in the game. Moving to the east of El Nath in Coldfield 2, there's a hidden portal at the top found in the middle of these saplings. This is the Crown Flyer. What is legitimately a hidden street, this map also underwent what I would refer to as a medium-sized change pre-Big Bang. It seems in version 49, there were a lot of weird changes to maps that I don't think people realize occurred. Prior to this update, the Crown Flyer consisted of Pepes and Junior Yetis. This is a fantastic combination of monsters. They're both decent EXP mobs, and Junior Yetis can drop Glove for Attack 60% scrolls, which were very valuable. After version 49, the Junior Yetis were replaced with White Fang enemies who possess a ranged attack. I'm not really sure if this change in mob spawns was a factor that contributed to this map's lack of memorable features, and I'm also unsure what the general consensus on this change was. Monkey Forest 2's revamp was very straightforward. The redesign of the map improved it substantially, to the point where it was actually an incredible option for hunters. This lateral change in mob spawns for the Crown Flyer seems almost pointless. It certainly didn't do a lot for the popularity of the map, as I never heard anyone talk about it during any era of the game. What I really appreciate about this map, and have always appreciated, is its bizarre layout and assets. Berry bushes in the background, saplings scattered around, and these weird triangle-shaped footholds make this map extremely memorable, even if it's a location I've never personally attempted to utilize on any class. I think the biggest hurdle to get over when it comes to grinding here are the Pepes. They move too fast, and the platforms on the right are just a bit too small for most classes to comfortably train here. I think warriors, bandits, and fire poison mages would make the best use of this map, both pre and post version 49. Pepes, Junior Yetis, and White Fangs were all weak to fire after all. For all I know, this could be a fire poison mage's paradise. Regardless of what people thought of this obscure map, I find it very charming, and it's definitely a top pick for me in terms of favorite OSMS maps. Though it does still exist in modern MapleStory, for now. As we continue our journey towards Zachem, which I guess is where we're heading, we eventually find ourselves in Wolf territory. There are 5 of these maps, and they're quite similar in both layout and monster composition. As you progress through the Wolf territory maps, you start out in an area that doesn't seem too intimidating. Yes, there's a lot of climbing to do as we're effectively traversing through a mountain range, but it's not too imposing quite yet. Wolf Territory 1 and 2 start out with a somewhat intimidating, dense forest background. It's practically screaming at you to not even attempt to move forward, but as we move on to Wolf Territory 3 and 4, we find a few man-made bridges and a background that shows us that there's a lot more to this Wolf Territory than what we're capable of exploring ourselves. Wolf Territory 5 is the final map before reaching the Forest of Dead Trees. Towards the top of Wolf Territory 5, and in the background of the Forest of Dead Trees, we see what appears to be a castle way off in the distance. This shot always reminds me of the ending of Castlevania. This castle has been present in the background of these maps since El Nath launched. Even looking through very old KMS files, we still see this castle. This is interesting because eventually this same area received the Lion King's castle, which contained Von Leon. This was very, very impactful content for the game. I'm not sure if this castle asset was meant to be anything initially. It's more likely that the designers just took what the artists had already created and made the Lion King castle out of it, and it just happened to conveniently work out. Or maybe there's a deeper story here, and the El Nath Mountains were always meant to have a castle that they just couldn't make happen until post-Big Bang. Wolf Territory sits in that weird place in my memory where I was never high enough level during the era that farming lycanthropes and werewolves was relevant, but I was very aware of its presence in the meta. Blue Screamers, Ilby Throwing Stars, Candines, Doombringers. These were just a few of the items that motivated players to take on these gigantic wolf enemies. Monsters who are effectively the second evolution of the White Fangs and Hectors that we find closer to El Nath. Though I've never farmed these enemies, I do love this area and recognize the impact it had on early old-school MapleStory. The final map I want to take a look at in this episode is Happyville, an event-only area that received small changes as it returned for our holiday events every year. Happyville doesn't come around anymore, but there's plenty to discuss about it. Heading back to Christmas of 2004, we see the first version of Happyville that we received in GMS. I also believe this to be the very first iteration of Happyville in general. The first version of the map is very dark. It gives off late-night vibes that I find genuinely comforting. The cold, dark, quiet winter nights. The buildings are all soft in their design as well. They have very few straight lines, which are usually reserved for the structural features of the building, and this almost cartoonish look, coupled with the glowing lights from inside the buildings, I think contributes a lot to this map not feeling sinister in any way. It's Christmas and it's nighttime. That's all that this map conveys to me. The initial version of Happyville was around during the beta, but I wasn't playing at that time, so I never actually got to see this version of it. Happyville would be updated slightly for Christmas of 2006, adding Mr. Kit Kat and Maple Claus, who were both involved with the Christmas event, but the appearance of Happyville remained unchanged for now. In 2007, Happyville received its aesthetic revamp. A lot of the assets were redesigned to be brighter and more colorful, and while I really love the original Happyville, I can definitely understand why they wanted to go this direction. It's more fun. Happyville's overall design would remain unchanged until sometime in the mid-2010s, I believe 2015 or 2016, where we saw a redesign of the map that was, interestingly, a hybrid of the original beta Happyville and the redesign that we had for many years. The colors aren't quite as bright as the redesign, but they're not quite as dark as the original, and we see Santa in the background as a silhouette instead of a cartoon character. I actually had no idea this version of the map ever existed, but it really is the best of both worlds. Shortly after this redesign, Happyville would close for the very last time. We haven't had a return to this Christmas map in many years now, and it's unlikely we'll be seeing it again. Talking to the snowmen would lead the player to these special maps that held trees meant for decorating. There are 15 different versions of this map in the files, and each of them had special properties that allowed players to drop whatever they wanted on the ground without any fear of another player picking up that item. Looting other players' items was completely disallowed by the map. There was also no worry about losing anything you dropped via the use of the Everlast flag that was enabled on all of these maps. People were able to safely show off their high-level gear or just design the tree however they wanted. Tree decorating is a small thing that, in hindsight, perhaps seems a bit silly. Who cares about decorating a tree when we could be killing monsters and leveling up, right? But I think this feature illustrates, better than most things I've ever discussed about MapleStory, the desire that we had to just have fun with games when we were younger. We never worried about how much EXP we were losing out on when we were having fun decorating Christmas trees in Happyville with our MapleStory friends. There weren't a ton of things in the game that allowed us a creative outlet to make our own fun with the tools given, even if the tools in this case were quite simple. It was the mid-2000s. We weren't all masters of Photoshop and After Effects back then. A simple toggled variable on a map that allowed us to drop whatever we wanted without any fear of losing it, coupled with a selection of items that were sold for very cheap from an NPC that were meant specifically for tree decorating, resulted in some of the fondest memories that players had. You can find a ton of screenshots of people's decorated trees, and very few of these screenshots feature a tree that was expertly or often even meticulously decorated. These screenshots usually just feature people who wanted to create something together and didn't care about much else. Even if they were just showing off their items, these screenshots capture a moment of happiness that MapleStory players of the era enjoyed, and I find these tree decorating maps to be very special for that reason. Happyville in general was very inclusive, containing all sorts of events for various holidays that occur in December. We could get items like Gelt chocolate from the Hanukkah events, and in hindsight, I find it really cool that there was enough care given to include content that wasn't specifically just for Christmas. Happyville is a very special place, and it's not just because it's covered in snow. There's a lot to it that solidified it as this special place in our minds when we were younger. Happyville is not a forgotten map. It's very fondly remembered, actually. I didn't even realize that I had such a strong opinion on it until writing this script. People loved Happyville, and it's very obvious why. It's a sentiment you can find expressed online without too much digging. This map may not be forgotten, but I and many others certainly miss it. Thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube. At the big tier, we have Jerry L, Anonymous, Evan Bat Eater, Miller GG Easy, and Jacob. Thank you guys so much. That means the world to me. Your Patreon memberships honestly make my job so much easier and safer. So thank you guys so much. Thank you to the Togain and Togain Junior tier members as well. Even though this list is growing and I don't have time to read everyone's name anymore, it does mean the world to me. If you want to support me, there are a few different ways to do so, and you can find links to that in the description of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.